Rethinking the ADHD diagnosis. A critical examination of its validity and alternatives. Brought to you by Johannes Keating. ADHD, or Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, is one of the most commonly diagnosed disorders today, characterized by symptoms such as inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. These symptoms can manifest as difficulty staying focused, excessive fidgeting, trouble following through on tasks, and acting on impulses without thinking about the consequences. By the way, you can find references and supporting literature in the description section of this video. ADHD is often treated as a clear-cut neurological issue, but what if the reality is far more complex? What if ADHD, as we know it, might not be a distinct disorder at all? In this video, we're diving into a heated debate that could change how you think about ADHD entirely. Is ADHD really a standalone condition? Or could the symptoms be explained by something else, like unregulated anxiety or deep-seated psychological defense mechanisms? We'll peel back the layers and question why ADHD lacks unique biological markers and explore the overlap between ADHD and anxiety disorders. But we're not stopping there. We'll also dive into a provocative and speculative hypothesis. Could some ADHD symptoms actually be defensively learned behaviors? Let's talk about how the way we frame ADHD can change everything about how someone views their condition. When ADHD is diagnosed purely as a neurological disorder, it can feel pretty disempowering. Why? Because it suggests you're stuck with these symptoms and your only options are medication and trying to manage them as best as you can. This can lead to a feeling of helplessness, like the root cause is something that can't be changed, just managed. But what if there's a more hopeful perspective? A psychodynamic approach to ADHD offers just that. Instead of seeing these symptoms as fixed, this view suggests they might be rooted in deeper unconscious issues, like defense mechanisms or unresolved psychological conflicts. This means there's room for meaningful change. Through therapy, you can dig into these underlying causes and work towards resolving them, not just managing the symptoms. This approach empowers people by giving them agency in their own healing process, offering a much more optimistic view of what's possible. The big debate. Is ADHD really what we think it is? Now let's dive into a big question that's sparking a lot of debate. Is ADHD really a distinct disorder, or is it something else? Psychologists, psychiatrists, and neuroscientists have been debating this for a while. The big question here is whether ADHD, as we currently define it, is a coherent and identifiable condition. Some argue that what we call ADHD might actually be better explained by other factors, like unregulated anxiety, unconscious defense mechanisms, or even the side effects of stimulant medications. The missing biological markers. One of the biggest critiques against ADHD being its own thing is the lack of a unique biological marker. Think about it. Most medical conditions have clear diagnostic tests, right? But with ADHD, we rely on behavioral criteria, which can be pretty subjective and open to interpretation. This raises a major question. Is ADHD really a well-defined disorder? Or is it just a mix of symptoms that overlap with other conditions like anxiety or depression? when ADHD symptoms look a lot like anxiety. Speaking of anxiety, did you know that some symptoms of ADHD can also show up in anxiety disorders? For example, chronic free-floating anxiety, like what you see in generalized anxiety disorder, can cause distractibility, restlessness, trouble concentrating, and problems with short-term memory. Sound familiar? These are core features of ADHD too. This overlap makes you wonder, could some ADHD diagnoses actually be anxiety in disguise? A speculative twist. Could ADHD be a learned behavior? Now here's a speculative but fascinating idea. What if some ADHD symptoms aren't just neurobiological but are actually learned behaviors? Imagine a child mimicking their distracted, emotionally unavailable parent, not just as a coping mechanism, but as a way to stay emotionally connected. By being like them, the child might feel closer to the parent, even if it means picking up some not-so-great habits. This behavior might also act as a defense mechanism. For a child, realizing that a parent isn't fully present can be really painful. By adopting similar inattentive behaviors, the child blurs the line between themselves and their parent, which helps them avoid facing the hard truth. It's like saying, if I'm distracted too, I don't have to notice that you're not paying attention to me. And this mimicking could actually strengthen or preserve the emotional bond, even if it's not the healthiest connection. In a family where emotional availability is scarce, behaving like an inattentive parent might be the child's way of maintaining closeness, even at their own expense. This idea suggests that ADHD-like behaviors might sometimes serve a dual purpose, as a defense against tough emotional realities and as a way to stay connected to a distracted parent. While this is just a hypothesis and doesn't have solid empirical backing, it's grounded in concepts from attachment theory, social learning theory, and research on childhood defense mechanisms. These ideas help us understand how ADHD symptoms could, in some cases, be seen as learned behaviors shaped by the child's environment and relationships. Case study. When ADHD might actually be anxiety. Let's dive deeper into a real-world example that highlights the complexities of diagnosing ADHD. Meet Tom, a bright and energetic 10-year-old boy who was initially diagnosed with ADHD. Tom's teachers had noticed that he was frequently daydreaming, had trouble staying focused during lessons, and often seemed restless in class. Classic signs of ADHD. Concerned, his parents sought out a diagnosis, and Tom was quickly labeled as having ADHD. However, as time went on, Tom's parents began to notice a pattern that the initial diagnosis hadn't captured. Tom's symptoms didn't just occur in the classroom. They seemed to intensify during specific situations at home, particularly during times of family conflict or before stressful events like exams at school. For example, if there was tension between his parents or if he was worried about an upcoming test, Tom's daydreaming would become more pronounced. His ability to focus would decline sharply, and his restlessness would escalate. This observation raised a red flag for his parents, prompting them to dig deeper. They decided to seek a second opinion and brought Tom to a specialist for a more comprehensive evaluation. After a thorough assessment, which included discussions about his home environment, school life, and emotional well-being, the specialist identified that Tom also exhibited signs of generalized anxiety disorder, GAD. GAD is characterized by chronic excessive worry about a variety of issues, ranging from schoolwork to family dynamics, often accompanied by physical symptoms like headaches, stomach aches, and a constant sense of unease. In Tom's case, his anxiety seemed to be the underlying force driving his inattention and restlessness. The symptoms that were initially attributed to ADHD were, in fact, more consistent with an anxiety disorder. And more significantly, it was discovered that when Tom learned to acknowledge underlying emotions such as sadness and anger, the anxiety and the symptoms that had given rise to the original diagnosis of ADHD diminished. This realization led to a shift in his treatment approach. The results were telling. As Tom's anxiety was brought under control, his ability to focus improved significantly, and his restlessness diminished. His daydreaming, once thought to be a hallmark of ADHD, became less frequent as his worries were addressed. This dramatic improvement led his healthcare providers to reconsider the original ADHD diagnosis, recognizing that what was once labeled as ADHD was actually a manifestation of anxiety, in turn caused by painful and frightening emotions that Tom had been bottling up. Tom's story is a powerful example of how anxiety can mimic ADHD symptoms, raising important questions about the accuracy of such diagnoses. It underscores the need for a holistic approach when evaluating children for ADHD, one that considers not only their behavior in isolated settings like the classroom, but also the broader context of their emotional and environmental experiences. Tom's case encourages us to think more critically about how we diagnose and treat conditions like ADHD, emphasizing the importance of looking beyond surface symptoms to uncover the true underlying causes. Counterarguments. So let's talk about a study that's really been making waves in the ADHD debate. The meta-analysis by Cortese et al. For 2012 found some intriguing evidence about brain differences in people with ADHD. They noticed significant variations in brain areas linked to attention and impulse control. This study seems to back the idea that ADHD might have specific neurobiological roots, suggesting that the brain differences aren't just random, but actually point to a distinct disorder. This runs counter to the main argument of this video, which questions whether ADHD is truly a unique neurobiological condition. Essentially, Cortese's findings hint that ADHD could be tied to identifiable brain abnormalities, which challenges the notion that ADHD symptoms might be explained by other factors like attachment trauma. But before we take these findings as gospel, there are some important caveats to consider. Meta-analyses like Cortese's pull together data from a bunch of different studies, each with its own methods and techniques. This mix and match approach can introduce a lot of variability, making it tricky to come to solid conclusions. Critics also point out that the brain differences observed might not be exclusive to ADHD. They could overlap with other conditions or reflect general developmental differences rather than pinpointing something uniquely ADHD related. This means we need more precise and standardized research to truly understand whether these brain differences are specific to ADHD or if they're part of a broader picture. Could ADHD be an unconscious defense mechanism? Adding another layer to the complexity, what if some ADHD behaviors are actually unconscious defense mechanisms? From a psychodynamic perspective, behaviors like hyperactivity or inattention might be ways to deal with anxiety, fear, or other uncomfortable feelings. For instance, a child might be hyperactive as a way to release overwhelming anxiety or inattentive to avoid focusing on distressing thoughts. And the fact that these behaviors stick around over time doesn't rule out this idea. Chronic psychological defenses can lead to long-lasting symptoms. Questioning what neuroimaging really shows. You've probably heard about neuroimaging studies that supposedly prove ADHD's biological basis, but here's the thing. These studies aren't without their own issues. For example, reduced activity in the prefrontal cortex, which many ADHD studies point to, could also be explained by psychological processes like suppression. Suppression is when we consciously push uncomfortable thoughts or feelings out of our awareness, which could lead to that same reduced brain activity. So, the neuroimaging results that we think support ADHD might actually be showing the brain's response to chronic stress or defense mechanisms. The non-specific effects of stimulants. A double-edged sword. Stimulant medications are often used to treat ADHD because they help improve attention and reduce hyperactivity. But here's something that complicates things. These drugs also boost focus and cognitive function in people without ADHD. That means their effects aren't unique to ADHD. This non-specificity makes you wonder, are we really treating ADHD, or are we just seeing the general effects of these medications? And don't forget the placebo effect, which can make people believe they're improving simply because they expect to. The role of Big Pharma in shaping ADHD. We can't ignore the role that Big Pharma plays in all of this. Pharmaceutical companies have a huge financial stake in the diagnosis and treatment of ADHD, given the massive market for stimulant medications. This creates a strong incentive to promote ADHD as a distinct and widespread condition, often through aggressive marketing that highlights the benefits of medication while downplaying alternative explanations. The influence of Big Pharma on public perception, diagnostic criteria, and treatment guidelines raises serious ethical questions about whether ADHD is being pathologized for profit rather than being understood as a complex, nuanced condition. The risks of overdiagnosis and misdiagnosis. With all these factors at play, the risk of overdiagnosis and misdiagnosis becomes even more pressing. If ADHD symptoms can be explained by other factors like anxiety or defense mechanisms, then the diagnosis might be applied too broadly, capturing a wide range of behaviors that don't necessarily point to a single underlying disorder. Overdiagnosis doesn't just pathologize normal behavior variations. It also diverts attention and resources from understanding and treating the true underlying causes. The bigger picture. Cultural and environmental context. Let's not forget the cultural and environmental context in which ADHD is diagnosed. The increasing demands of modern life, whether in school or at work, requires sustained attention and self-regulation, which not everyone can easily muster. This pressure can lead to more ADHD diagnoses, even when the real issue might be anxiety, stress, or a mismatch between individual temperaments and societal expectations. Modern lifestyle factors like too much screen time, lack of exercise, and poor diet might also contribute to symptoms associated with ADHD, making the picture even more complicated. subjectivity, and the problem of comorbidity. There's also the issue of subjectivity in diagnosing ADHD. Behavioral observations and self-reports are influenced by the biases of both the observer and the individual being assessed. This variability can undermine the construct validity of ADHD. Plus, ADHD often co-occurs with other psychological disorders, like anxiety and depression. High rates of comorbidity raise questions about whether ADHD is truly a distinct disorder or just a label applied to overlapping symptoms of other conditions. How stable is an ADHD diagnosis? Over time? Another thing to consider is the stability of an ADHD diagnosis over time. Some studies suggest that many children diagnosed with ADHD no longer meet the criteria as adults, which raises questions about the long-term validity of the diagnosis. It also makes us wonder about the potential harm of labeling kids with a lifelong disorder when their symptoms might change or even resolve over time. Ethical considerations. The long-term impact of ADHD labels and medications. Finally, we need to talk about the ethical implications of labeling children with ADHD and prescribing stimulant medications at a young age. What are the long-term psychological and physiological effects? How does this impact a child's self-identity and development? Is it really ethical to medicate kids for behaviors that might be within the normal range of development, especially in a society that increasingly values compliance and focus? The trend of medicalizing education to meet academic standards raises further concerns about whether ADHD is more about societal pressures than an inherent disorder. Conclusion. The ongoing debate on ADHD's reality. In the end, whether ADHD is a real disorder depends on how we define and validate psychological constructs. If ADHD is to be understood as a distinct neurodevelopmental disorder, its construct validity must be strong enough to separate it from other explanations like unregulated anxiety and unconscious defense mechanisms. The speculative hypothesis that ADHD symptoms might also be defensively learned behaviors adds another layer of complexity, suggesting that environmental and relational factors could play a big role in how these symptoms manifest. This debate isn't just academic. It has real implications for how we diagnose, treat, and understand human behavior in today's world. As research continues to evolve, it's crucial to critically examine the assumptions behind the ADHD diagnosis. A more nuanced understanding, one that takes into account psychological, environmental, and socio-cultural factors, can lead to treatment approaches that are both scientifically grounded and ethically sound. This way, we move beyond just managing symptoms and start fostering meaningful, lasting change. That completes this video. Thank you for watching, and feel free to let me know what you think. Take care, and bye for now.